Right now, there are stones sitting in ancient quarries that are so massive, our most powerful modern cranes would literally snap like toothpicks if they even tried to lift them. I mean, I'm standing right here before a mystery that defies every law of conventional archaeology as we know it. We're told these monuments were built by sheer muscle and primitive tools. But look, the physics tells a completely different story. One of impossible weight and a forgotten mastery. Why? Why is the truth about our past being suppressed? I'm opening a cold case today that goes back over 12,000 years to find out who really moved the world. Just think about the trilithon at Baalbek in Lebanon. We're talking about 3 massive blocks of limestone sitting right there in the retaining wall of the Temple of Jupiter. Each one weighs over 800 tons. To put that in perspective, a modern heavy lift crane, the kind used to build skyscrapers or move oil rigs, it reaches its limit long before it even touches something of that magnitude. If I tried to move one of those blocks today, I'd need a specialized engineering crew, months of planning, and millions of dollars in equipment. Yet these stones were transported from a quarry nearly a mile away and lifted 20 feet into the air with surgical precision. Now, the official narrative says this was all done by the Romans, using wooden cranes and ropes. But I've looked at the math, and the math does not lie. A wooden crane under that kind of tension wouldn't just break, it would explode into splinters. Warps made of hemp or papyrus, they would snap like thread. We're looking at a level of logistics that suggests the builders weren't just strong. I mean, they were using a physics we no longer understand. And it's not just Baalbek. I've seen the same impossible engineering in the unfinished obelisk of Aswan and the megalithic walls of Peru. These sites, they share a DNA of impossibility. We're taught that history is a straight line of progress, starting with primitive man and ending with us at the peak of technology. But when you stand in the shadow of a 1,000-ton stone that's been sitting there for millennia, you start to realize that the timeline we were given is a lie. I'm talking about a pre-flood world. A period of human history that was wiped clean by a global cataclysm, leaving only these massive, indestructible calling cards behind. The question isn't just how they moved these stones. The bigger question is who were they? And why is mainstream science so desperate to keep their existence in the dark? Stick with me, because we're going into the quarry to look at the evidence that they don't want you to see. This is the truth about the 1,000-ton problem. Standard history books tell us a convenient story, right? They want you to believe that if you just add enough time and an endless supply of labor, any miracle of engineering is possible. They paint this picture of thousands of barefoot slaves sweating under a relentless sun, using nothing but copper chisels and brute force to shape the ancient world. I mean, it's a neat, tidy narrative that fits perfectly into the timeline they constructed for human progress. But when I stand in front of a 1,000-ton block of solid rose granite, when you see the math, it simply doesn't add up.
I believe we are being sold a fairy tale to cover up a massive gap in our understanding of the human past. Think about the reality of the materials for a moment, okay? Most of these megalithic sites aren't made of soft limestone. They're built from igneous rocks like granite, basalt, and diorite. On the Mohs scale of mineral hardness, granite sits at a 6 or a 7. Copper? It struggles to reach a 3. Look, it's a basic law of physics. You cannot cut or shape a harder material with a softer one without the softer tool being obliterated in the process. If I gave you a copper chisel and asked you to carve your name into a granite slab, you'd spend the entire day sharpening your tool, and you wouldn't even leave a scratch on the surface. Now, imagine trying to quarry a block the size of a 3-story house. Experiments have been done to try and prove the mainstream theory. They show that you can, eventually, scrape away a tiny amount of stone using copper and sand as an abrasive, but there's a massive problem with these demonstrations. They never account for the scale. They show you a few inches of progress and then tell you to multiply that by 1,000,000. They ignore the precision. They ignore the razor-sharp 90-degree angles. And they certainly ignore the sheer speed that would be required to finish these monuments within the lifetimes of the pharaohs or kings who allegedly commissioned them. The gatekeepers of history are desperate to keep us focused on the how many men question so that we don't start asking the what kind of technology question. They want you to think our ancestors were primitive, because if they won't, it means we've forgotten a chapter of our own story, a chapter that might prove we aren't the pinnacle of human achievement after all. So, if copper tools were useless, and the standard explanation is a lie, what were they actually using? When I look closer at these stones, I don't see the marks of a chisel at all. I see something much more disturbing. I see the fingerprints of a technology that shouldn't have existed for thousands of years. But that's not even the craziest part. Because as impossible as the cutting was, wait until I show you the marks left behind in the quarries of Aswan. Marks that look less like a hammer and more like a giant power tool. I want you to look at these megaliths, not as primitive construction projects, but as cold, hard data points in a forensic investigation. You see, if the standard copper chisel and wooden roller theory feels like a fairy tale to you, well, it's because it probably is. I'm actually convinced we aren't looking at the work of wandering tribes, but the shattered remnants of a pre-flood global power. A civilization that operated on a technological paradigm so different from our own that we literally can't see what's right in front of our eyes. I'm talking about a world where sound and vibration were more than just entertainment. They were tools. We've been taught that history is a slow upward climb from the mud, but what if I told you that we are actually the ones living in the dark? Think about acoustic levitation. It sounds like science fiction, right? But today, we can actually use sound waves to suspend matter in mid-air. If these ancients understood the resonant frequency of granite, I mean, they wouldn't have needed thousands of slaves. They would have needed a tuning fork and the right frequency to make a 1,000-ton block weigh as much as a feather.
But maybe, just maybe, the answer isn't in how they moved the stones. Maybe it's in how they made them. There's a growing body of evidence for geopolymer chemistry. The idea that these massive blocks weren't carved at all, but cast like modern concrete using a lost chemical formula. It would explain why the joints are so tight you can't even fit a human hair between them. They weren't fitting stones, you see. They were pouring them. Look, this isn't just alternative history. This is a crime scene where the evidence has been sitting out in the rain for 12,000 years. If sound waves could manipulate matter, or if the stones were cast using advanced chemistry, the impossible suddenly becomes elementary. This was a technological peak that was wiped off the map by a planetary disaster, so violent it reset the human clock to 0. But who held this knowledge? And more importantly, did they leave behind a black box for us to find? I used to think the stones were the only evidence left, but then I started looking at the maps. And what I found suggests that the most dangerous piece of this puzzle isn't a stone at all. It's a location that shouldn't exist. I want you to actually
actually look at the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, Lebanon. For centuries, well, we've been told the Romans built this. But when you look at the base, you see something that makes the Roman work look like child's play. I'm talking about the Trilithon, 3 massive limestone blocks, each weighing over 800 tons. To put that in perspective, that's the weight of 2 Boeing 747s. These stones weren't just moved, they were hoisted 20 feet into the air and placed with such precision that you can't even fit a razor blade between them. The Romans were incredible engineers, don't get me wrong, but their most advanced police systems could barely handle a tenth of this weight. Actually, there is no historical record, no diagram, and no logical explanation for how a primitive labor force moved 800-ton monoliths uphill and stacked them like Lego bricks. It suggests that the Romans didn't build the foundation. They simply found it and built their temple on top of a platform they couldn't possibly understand. But if you think Baalbek is impressive, I need to take you to the Yangshan Quarry in China. This is where the narrative of primitive tools completely falls apart. Lying on its side is a monolith so large it defies the imagination. It's estimated to weigh 16,000 tons. That isn't a stone. It's a skyscraper made of solid rock. If we tried to move this today, even our largest industrial cranes would buckle and snap. Yet someone, thousands of years ago, began carving it directly out of the mountainside. Why would you start a project this ambitious if you didn't have the technology to finish it? You wouldn't. You only start cutting a 16,000-ton block if you were absolutely certain you can move it. When I look at the surfaces of these stones, I see something even more haunting than their size. I see the fingerprints of the machine. Under a microscope, the stones at sites like Baalbek and Yangshan show microstriations, perfectly parallel grooves that suggest high-speed drills and circular saws were used long before the Iron Age supposedly began. These aren't the jagged marks of a copper chisel or stone hammer. These are the marks of power tools. We're looking at evidence of a technological peak that should not exist in our timeline.
So what happened to the people who owned these tools? Why did they walk away from 16,000-ton projects and leave them to be swallowed by the earth? The answer lies in the scars left on our planet roughly 12,800 years ago. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden, violent cataclysm. I believe this godlike engineering didn't just fade away, it was wiped out in a planetary heartbeat. The marks we see on these stones aren't just tool marks, they're the final signatures of a civilization that was reset to zero by fire and flood. But as I dug deeper into these sites, I realized that the stones themselves are only half the story. The real mystery isn't just how they built these monuments, it's what they were trying to tell us. Because when you align these locations on a global map, a pattern emerges that suggests these lost engineers were tracking something in the stars. Terrifying realization. And according to their calculations, the disaster that ended their world might be scheduled to return to ours. In a low, awestruck tone, as I stand here in the shadow of these monolithic giants, I realize the real mystery isn't just how they move the stones. No, it's why. Why we've been conditioned to forget that they ever did. Thoughtful and deliberate. You see, we are taught a linear story of human progress, a slow, steady climb from primitive tools to modern tech. But these 1,000-ton anomalies, they simply don't fit that narrative. Increasingly intense. They are uncomfortable truths that the gatekeepers of history would rather you just ignore. Why the silence? Because acknowledging that a pre-flood civilization possessed technology we still can't replicate, well, it would force us to rewrite every single textbook on the planet. With a hint of sorrow, it would mean admitting that we aren't the pinnacle of human achievement, but rather
A species with amnesia, struggling to find its way back to a forgotten peak. As I dig deeper, I realize that by reclaiming this lost history, we are just looking at ruins, right? We are looking into a mirror of our own potential, and perhaps our own future. Building wonder. These builders, they didn't choose stone by accident. Directly, they knew that digital records would vanish in a heartbeat, and that iron would rust into nothingness. Awe-inspired, they chose the most enduring material on Earth to leave a message that time itself couldn't erase. The cataclysm that ended their era. It could happen again. To them, you see, these stones weren't just foundations. They were a silent warning, left for us to find. Urgent. They were telling us that no matter how high a civilization rises, it can all be taken away in a single, violent shift of the earth. The truth, it isn't buried under miles of dirt. It's sitting right in front of us, too big for them to hide. I mean, look at the precision of the joints at Pomabonku, and the sheer scale of the blocks at Baalbek. I've come to understand that we are living on a planet of ghosts, and it's time we finally started listening to what they're trying to say. The evidence is there for anyone brave enough to look. Stay curious, because the real human story is far more incredible than the one we've been told. Join the investigation and help me piece together the fragments of a forgotten past. If you're ready to see what's been hidden in plain sight, subscribe to Shadow Legends and walk this path